good morning to the Caron YouTube audience, and another good morning to those of you who are here with us in person, and also to anybody who is on campus around with the live stream closed circuit broadcast. So, yay. As I often do, I'd like to start with a story. A tad bit embarrassing, but that's not a first either. I'm thinking I was 18 years old. I was in my third year of college, so I did start that journey a little earlier than some. And I had transferred from one undergraduate institution to another. And I had some excitement in particular because the institution that I went to was had a reputation at the time for being a big party school, and I was already in full-blown substance use disorder, active addiction, although I did not think of myself in that way at all. And I was a cynical atheist, as will be revealed here shortly. So, no secret, Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts was a weird school and still is, and small liberal arts, no grades, and design your own major, and this terrible reputation for being the right place in the Pioneer Valley for people who wanted the best parties. So, of a certain night while I was there in my, maybe my first year at Hampshire, but my third year of undergraduate study, there was a party. I remember the scene very well. The party space that was for sanctioned parties, besides people's dorm rooms, was a gallery. And so there was some sort of a gallery exhibit, and there were tons of people, and there was loud music, and I am sure I was not of clear, sound mind, and I remember some guy came up to me in the midst of this party. It was not unusual at Hampshire parties for people from other places, other institutions around to attend our parties. In fact, people would bus in from other schools just because of the reputation. So some guy came up to me and was like, Jack! And I turned around and looked, and it was one of my high school friends whose home we used to frequent as a place to do all kinds of drugs. And this guy's first name was Jim, and he was like, "It's Jimmy." And it took me a minute to locate, because you know when you see people and they're in the wrong context, you don't know how to place them. But I was like, "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" And over the next couple of minutes, I don't know why he was even at this party, because of course my purposes for being at any party were intoxication. But Jimmy identified himself as a person who who had been born again, and was deeply moved, as many of you know what he was meaning by that, by the story of Jesus. And I guess he was setting himself up to ask me if I was interested in learning about that, which is often where that conversation goes. But I don't know if he could read my face or whatever. I at that time equated the phrase being born again with late night TV evangelism, and I had nothing but disdain and contempt for people who would self-describe that way, especially on a casual encounter with a stoned former, acquaintance. And this has stayed with me for years and years, and I've often wondered, if I ever were to look him up and get in touch with him and told him, what my business card says, how he would feel. But I've come a long way, obviously, from my cynical, sneering, I'm better and smarter than that. I used to say, well, if people need that, too bad for them, but somehow thinking that was gentle and nice, but I was really arrogant and critical of this notion of. I think the other scene that I have in my mind is a movie scene. It's a classic movie, so even some of the young people may say, but there's a movie called The Blues Brothers, in which John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd are in the back of a church, and there's a ray of light that comes down, and it sort of strikes them in this epiphany, and the next thing you know, the two are depicted as doing cartwheels up the center aisle. It's I'm not sure if I get the scene exactly right there, but it's an exuberant transformation moment. And so that's really the subject of my message for today, and I have many more things to say, too many things to say, so I'm trying to prune in my head. But my title for this week's topic is New Birth, not born again, but new birth. And that's another, when I was in seminary, I studied this phenomenon under the category of new birth. It's a category of Christian theology, but it's also in other wisdom traditions. And the other term that is often associated with it within the Christian tradition is regeneration, which I think is informative. And obviously what I want to do is I want to make a correlation between what Jimmy, my friend, was testifying to in my young, intoxicated moment, my own transformation of life, whatever it is that brings you to the red chair or the Caron YouTube channel, because I'm going to presume there's some close proximity to the phenomenon of addiction. And then how this relates to addiction recovery, both generally and quite personally, and for you, not just for me. So, is there such a thing or not? That's the right academic question to ask. Is, was my initial skepticism well warranted? And should one dismiss, sneer, laugh, or just be suspicious of people's claims that they were one way and suddenly have become another? There's an old adage that I remember learning about when I was a child, and I applied it generally, which is the leopard doesn't change its spots, right? And I applied that to myself in addiction because I kind of thought I was trapped in my patterns of using and that it would never change. I saw my parents drinking the way I was drinking, and I saw my siblings using substances, other substances besides alcohol, the way I was using them, and I just thought this was the next generation's expression of the same sort of fundamental patterns, and just, people from my family were just gonna, and my vision of the end of my life was somehow to have a cabin in the wilderness where I would have an infinite supply of weed and alcohol, and another Hampshire College expression we used to all joke about, like, I just wanted the 4 fundamental food groups: caffeine, nicotine, aspirin, and alcohol. And this is how flippant and sort of, given over to the notion that that's who and where my life was always going to be. I didn't believe that people changed. But over time, I have changed, and I have seen other people change, and the experience of seeing other people change, worked its way into my thought world that, people don't really change, because all of a sudden I was like, well, then how are you going to explain this or that? I watched my younger brother, James, he's still clean and sober. He's sober 40 years. And I remember when I saw him get clean and sober, I was like, uh-oh, way too close to home, right? It's like, I think there was a sad, dark part of me that wanted him to not succeed in his recovery because it might imply that I should be able to take a look at my own use. And when I was at Hampshire, I was a math major, math and physics, and music. So a lot of study of different things, and I was at a school where I could put all of those things together, and I enjoyed that, and I liked academics, I liked analytical thinking, I still do, and I like to think, because of the music part of me, that I can straddle the left-right brain stuff, but so I like creative approaches to analytical subjects and analytical approaches to creative subjects, and let me ask you to think with me for half a second about this idea that people could have the leopard change their spots experience. That they would go from a way you would describe them this way to suddenly a way you would describe them that way, as if it was like, wow, big shift. And you might be skeptical about that. Obviously, it has relevance here, right? It would be really nice to have the person who has the wristband, which identifies them as a Caron patient, be able to say, hey, I was this way, and now I'm that way. It's not hard to connect the dots of why this is a topic for chapel. But I'm wondering whether you're a person who is thinking about this as wholesale transformation, or are you thinking about what you seek at Caron as individual behavior modification? Because that's the underlying concern that I have. I'm now at the end of my message outline. But anyway, Okay, do such changes occur? They do. You've seen it. We've all seen it. We've all had people who are like weirdly all of a sudden or over a period of time manifest as dramatically different than they did a while back. And I don't mean just the cancer, but this is a kind of thing where a cancer or a heart attack or other things can cause people to have a profound shift in values and the person that you see afterwards. And literature is sprinkled with these kinds of stories throughout history. And early ones include in the Christian narratives the story of Saul who becomes Paul, and he's on the Damascus road and he's struck blind and then sees, and then he was a Roman soldier and he becomes this, follower of the early Christian movement and has had a profound influence on subsequent Western history and civilization. But Scrooge, right? Why is the Dickens Scrooge story so timeless that I can say one word name and like Prince or whatever, you're like, oh, I know Scrooge. And the whole story cascades in your mind and you think of this, we know that narrative, and it's compelling because it's a narrative of a person who was a jerk and becomes a humanistically generous and kind soul. What a change, right? When I was growing up, and today it's still all over the media, the Grinch, right? And recently we get Grinch Hershey Kisses, which I just find hilariously funny because of the sort of seeming contradiction there until, this must be a post-transformation Grinch that is sweet like chocolate, but the Grinch, my guess is you could add stories to this. There are King Lear. One of the essential aspects of the King Lear story is the change in the character. And also many of these transformation stories, it's like all the other minor or lesser characters also experience transformations in the shadows, surroundings, and downstream of this. It's a normal part of literature and the arts, is this idea. And you would think, oh, why don't I go and look up the research on massive transformations that defy analytical and model-based, because I'm sure what you're hoping, if you're a family member, is that I'm going to tell you by the time this is over exactly how to induce this, right? That's at least as it applies to addiction. But these things are a little beguilingly untamed. They occur and cause us to go, wow, but it's not entirely clear what the exact sequence of steps were that induced the transformation, or what exactly is the sine qua non, the thing without which it would not have occurred. And so anyway, is there research or not? Well, it turns out, interestingly, I'm going to borrow on claims made by a recent writer on the subject, that in the last 120 years, there's really only two major treatises on the subject of major transformation. In 1902, a book published by William James called The Variety of Religious Experience. It's a classic in both spiritual and religious literature, and a classic in this particular subject matter. And then just a few years ago, Bill Miller, who many of us who work here study Bill Miller's work on addiction treatment. He is a model for engaging clients that's had tremendous sway, not only in this field, but in other fields of medicine. But Bill Miller just recently published a book on, the title of the book, he has a co-author, DeBaca is her last name. So Miller and DeBaca's book, called Quantum Change, is a survey of people who claim that in their own lives they had this profound kind of a shift. And so they did tons of interviews of such people, and they looked at the William James book, and they tried to find more studies in between. Why would there not be more studies on this? I think it's because people who like analytic, algorithmic, and well-behaved things aren't inclined to study things that don't seem like they're going to manifest, good, reliable answers. That's my hypothesis. But a couple of things that James and Miller observed, fascinating, in a 120-year gap, they come up with various things that are very, very similar about what they're saying. One of these things is that sometimes these changes are accompanied by the Blues Brothers blinding flash of light, like woo-ah experience. And that could be the heart attack, or that could be, this may be part of what is influencing the role of psychedelics in mental health care. And facilitated psychedelic experiences would sort of fit this idea that you could have a bizarre and hard to describe sort of experience that would nonetheless induce lasting change. But the distinction between this is that many people have mystical experiences, many people have epiphanies, and go right back to what they were. But this particular category is when you can correlate an epiphany or a mystical experience with subsequent transformation. That's like the goal, that's the prize, is when, and I mean, I'm saying way too much about my story. I did tons of hallucinogenics, and then the next day I was, the epiphany would recede, and then I was in the same ruts that I had been in before. So these things do occur. They often have this sudden epiphanous event, but not always. In AA's core piece of literature, Bill Wilson, it's funny these Bills, William James, William Miller, and William Wilson. Bill Wilson writes about the William James book, and in one of the appendices to the AA literature, so after the first edition, they noted that there was a concern because there was an implication you could take from the AA literature that everyone who would get sober using this method would have this blinding white flash of light experience. And borrowing from William James, they say no, a significant number of people who exhibit the remarkable before and after transformation get there to some degree by increments, by what they call the educational variety of spiritual experience, a progressive transformation. I'm going to tell you, I have sort of both. If you look at my history, and if I were to tell you what happened to me, I certainly have moments of like, epiphanous stuff, including several things well into my sobriety that were profoundly arresting and caused me to shift my values even further. So I think it can be both and rather than either or. But if anybody's having a blinding experience, like flash of light, I'd tell you to roll with it and then make sure that you follow up with it, the transformation. Because otherwise it's not too far from the wild, crazy partying that we all used to do. And if you are lacking this epiphanous thing, don't give up, because in the pursuit of it over time, it appears that radical transformation can occur. What was my outline? The other thing I wanted to get to before I shut up, before I quiet myself, is to say that not only does Christianity invest itself a great deal in this notion of the before-after person, but Hinduism has a term for this kind of second life experience. And Buddhism, like the central story that most of us probably know something about in Buddhism, is an awakening story, in which Siddhartha Gautama was leading a certain kind of life before he has this awakening, and then has a transformed existence. So there's at least three major wisdom traditions, one Eastern and two Western two Eastern, one Western, that have this idea of new birth and new beginning, kind of this, like, deep within their fundamentals. And my guess is, as much as I am somewhat read in other traditions, I suspect that you would find this all over the place, because I think it's foundational to us in a way that is untamable and non-scientific. I think people do change, and people change dramatically and wildly and amazingly. And God, you surely hope so if you have ended up at Caron as a family member or a loved one. Because this is what I also want to say, is that the person in the room here who is thinking that what they want from Caron is the exercising of just this one thing. I just want to not drink. is undershooting the mark and setting themselves up for less than optimal outcomes. Because this part of our behavior is a consequence of other things, and it has incredible consequence on other things. It may be that a broken wrist can be repaired with little impact on the before and after if it's a simple break, but this is not that kind of a thing. This is, and our brain science location of the disease of addiction way down in the midbrain tells you it's like primal. It's going to have its effect on all of who we are, how we think, and what we do. So just like if you had a small tumor in the amygdala, that's a bad place to have a tumor. That's a midbrain sort of part of the brain, because in order to get to it, the neurosurgeon is going to mess up other parts of your thinking and being. This is not something surface and tangential and superficial, which allows for this kind of like little erasure. It underlies and is interwoven with your personal history, past and present and future. And so if it turns out to be the case that you can erase alcohol, drugs, and all that sort of stuff from your day-to-day existence, that will not be the only change that occurs. I mean, there's an expression in AA which is the white-knuckle drinker, and that person, non-drinker, and that person is thought to be trying to do exactly that, simply like removing their primary coping mechanism and therefore being really unstable. The early literature says restless, irritable, and discontented. I like to think of it as taking the bottle away from a baby. And what do you get? Right? And if at the beginning that's how that occurs for you, that's fine. In fact, that's one of the reasons why acute treatment and early post-acute withdrawal is warranted, because there is an instability in the initial removal of the pernicious symptom. But that's what I think our use disorders are. I think our addictions are a pernicious symptom of deeper things that warrant being modified and addressed. And as a result, when success occurs, you are able to look and go, wow, a lot has changed. This person is not just not drinking, but like they are just wildly and weirdly different. You are looking at a human being who absolutely exhibits that kind of bizarrely different than I was 35 years ago. Bizarrely different than I was 35 years ago. And I would like to tell you it all happened, I was just telling my story the other day, and I was talking about the first day I walked into an AA meeting without having had a drink earlier in that day, which was January 3rd, 1989, it's my sobriety date. And I do sense a kind of magic about that. There was no cartwheels and no blinding light, but there was a magic about the interaction. And there was something that happened for me in the world of AA that I think today replicates itself in these other opportunities that people have. So a last thing, I keep saying that, but a last thing I would say is that while my story has a strong aspect of Christian understanding and of AA and 12 steps, what I do believe today is that any good wisdom tradition, including even the 12-step tradition itself, and any recovery support option that provides mutuality of support and is a community that's dedicated to this process of abstinence long-term from your use disorder will do this. And at least it will, the people who avail themselves of this will exhibit this. If you talk to somebody who's done SMART for several years, we have a guy who does SMART meetings on Monday nights here, and he is a transformed being. Maybe even in some sense more than I, because his story is like grim, and yet he's an amazing success. And if you talk to somebody in Recovery Dharma who's been doing the Dharma thing for several years, I guarantee you will go, wow, this is really working in this person's world. And not just to have them not drink, but they're less of a schmuck. And I don't mean that drinkers and drug addicts are schmucks intentionally. None of us really are. We don't wake up in the morning and go, how can I harm my children and hurt my family and get myself in legal trouble? That's not our objective. Our objective, sadly, is driven by this hostage phenomenon that our life is totally married or imprisoned in this one channel. But those who want to be in relationship with us suffer. We hurt other people because of what we're doing. And in order to break the shackles of that, I think many of us think, oh, I just need to stop doing this. That will not do it. That's my point. That will not do it. Please set your horizons on change beyond mere cessation. And open your heart and mind to the notion that in some future date, people will look at you and go, wow, you are different. Because that's what happens when this works. And do I think you must ye confess Jesus as your Lord and Savior? I absolutely do not. If you think that that's what you're hearing from me, you're mishearing what I'm saying. But if you pursue this, that was what Carl Jung said to Bill Wilson in the exchanges that they had, was that this is not a well-tamed and well-governed thing. But if you, the best thing Carl Jung said to know was, why don't you put yourself around people who've had this happen to them? Because it's sort of weirdly contagious. And that's my best science about this. Put yourself around people who are exhibiting the change you want. While that sounds incredibly unrigorous, I'm sticking with it because I have watched it work. It's what happened to me that Tuesday night. My friend Doug, who I had the privilege later of becoming the minister at his memorial service when he died of leukemia, he tapped his hand on the chair. He said, I've been saving a seat for you. And my life changed from that moment forward in a way I didn't see coming. We've been saving a seat for you. May your change begin.